You see, we had to get perfect burns on the first stage, the second stage, the third stage. And the reason the Saturn V was there was because of that third stage. And so any time that we had a thing that even looked like a problem during testing, why, those were the first things we looked at, because this third stage was the only reason we were able to get to man on the moon. And of course the interface between that and the instrument unit. So if we had a hitch anywhere, the first things we'd look at is the Saturn V third stage and the interface with it, which was the brains of the Saturn V. And so I guess that was the thing that we put the time to and protected the most. And when it worked in tests time and time again, then we felt that we were ready to go. And we then, in our final reviews, everybody had to speak for himself if he was head of a whatever it was, and they went down man by man, item by item, and said, here's where we are, here's where we stand, here's the problems we had, here's how we solved them. And this is during the pre-launch, that on a much higher level that I'm talking about. They didn't get into all the problems at all, but that was a good thing. It really worked well, and the people that were on that team represented the total of NASA, because you'd have from the headquarters and from the Michoud down there for the firing parts of the things, and then of course here we had the laboratory directors where they were deeply involved, and they were the ones that answered the question, are you ready? And they felt really that they were ready when they said they were ready, and because they'd done everything in the world that they could do to make sure they were ready. Any problems they'd had, they were searching for. And it was a different mode of operation of running a program than I think any other program had been run. There was a multitude, 350,000 parts in that thing. And there's so many things that could go wrong. And yet the people would come forward, automatically come forward and say, we've got this problem. We don't know what to do about it, but here it is, and they'd outline it for us. And we'd put together a number of experts, and they would move. So it was the build-up, as I said before, of the enthusiasm that made this thing possible, in my opinion, to meet that time date. And so I couldn't have been more happy, and nor could Arthur Rudolph have been more happy. I had set up, we had a breadboard out there. This big trailer was the office of the people that were working the breadboard, and the description of the breadboard being, as I'm sure you know, and it's a pre-runner, if you will, of what the engine is doing and all the rest of them, and they were actual tests that we were doing. So every Thursday afternoon I'd have a meeting in this trailer, and all of the contractors, it was the main thing I had, was the contractors with the directors of each one of the things that were within the Saturn V program. And that too is a description of meetings that one would hardly ever believe, because during that meeting we'd probably extended 6 or 7 hours over the schedule. And no one, believe me, I don't know of anyone that really had something that they wanted to go to everybody in the world and tell them we shouldn't do this. And it was one of those necessary things that you had to have people looking at each other and saying, I did this, but you didn't do this, and therefore I can't do this. And you'd be amazed how that would come out and how it would work and how many people would walk out of that meeting, and within the time frame they had to work that, it was worked. But you see, what we were doing is face-to-face. You weren't writing letters. You weren't telephoning. And so that's why I had set it up that afternoon. And again, it was double or triple the time that I had set up for the meeting. And but the people that were most chagrined over the whole thing before could not get any help. They were not getting any help. And so they knew where to come to get the help. And whenever I needed Arthur Rudolph, I'd say, why don't you come on in and sit in this thing for a little while. He said, but Jim, you're doing fine. I said, no, come on in. We need you. And so Arthur would come on in and take over running the meeting for an hour or two, and he said, I don't think we have any problems. And I said, yes, we do, Arthur. And so about every third meeting, I'd say, Arthur, come on to this meeting. And that also gave them some initiative to really move out and get things done. And because he was running that program, and I wanted to make darn sure that everybody knew he was running that program. But that's the content of the meeting always, was to solve problems. I don't think I ever called a meeting that wasn't set up to solve a problem or a number of problems, because we didn't have time to do anything else. And so we didn't worry about a schedule of the people's time. We didn't worry about money coming in. We concentrated on one thing, and that's progress in the engineering and progress in putting that thing together. Because they had so many things that as we moved along would either fail or you had to get fixed immediately. And those things were vital. And so everybody understood it and worked toward that. And that's, again, what made it fun. When I came here, the laboratory directors were running the programs, and I use the word programs. And those that were in quotes, the program management had no control or little control. And so one of the first things I found was that we had contractors coming on, like General Electric and IBM and all the rest of them were coming on, and they weren't getting any help and getting any drawings, any discussions with the contractor, because all of the information was there within the laboratories. And that was another thing that had to be solved quickly. And so when I found out what had happened, GE at the time was trying to get drawings from Heusermann, and they were doing all the control of all the avionics and you name it, the electronics. And so I had the head man from GE in, and I got him in to talk to Arthur and myself so that the two of us would know the difficulties, because they were unable to act. So after getting the story, I then said to Arthur, we're going to have to do some quick fixes here. And it's going to hurt badly, each one of the lab directors, and they're going to be mad at us. So I said, if you want to back out a little, Arthur, why, go ahead. He said, no, I'm with you, I'm with you. And anyway, this all got to the point of turning over the drawings, closing out the lab, because they were making these engineering changes that were going on with no one telling them yes, no, or anything. Each one of the labs are making their own decisions on an engineering basis. So this night, I had called a couple people, and they came in, and nobody knew that, but they came in from Washington for this meeting. And Heusermann was running his part of the meeting because he was standing up against the GE people. And that meeting went on and on and on with some pretty good speakers that I had personally selected, and so had Arthur. And we had even dry run them before this thing happened. And the more it went on, then Huiseman said, well, I can't put up with this. And I didn't say a word. Arthur didn't say a word, but Werner was heading the meeting. And Werner said, you may have to put up with this. You may have to put up with this. So he sat there for another hour or two, and we explained it to these two people from Washington why we had to have this thing done. They knew it going in, of course. And Huiseman knew it going in, and he knew also after about 2.5 hours or 3 hours of the meeting, he'd lost. So it was about midnight, and the two guys from Washington said, we're going to have to leave, but I want a decision out of this meeting before we leave. And Werner spoke up and said, you have my decision, and we're going to do exactly the way that you've seen laid out, and that is you then will handle all of the drawings. You'll be charged with every problem that comes in, so you better watch out when, when this thing is turned over. And then Huiseman looked at me, and he looked at Arthur, and he banged on the table and got up and walked out. And he said, I quit. And Werner said, that's okay. It was a mean meeting, but it had to be. And it turned all the rest of the contractors around, too. That was the decision that had to be made. But it went on till midnight, and it was set up, because we'd never have gotten there. No way could we have gotten there without that. So that was kind of early on, the kind of problems that we ran into that had to be fixed. When I was in ballistic missiles, we had the Titan, Atlas, and Minuteman, and we were often in a lot of problems, and especially initially in the Atlas, because we were not controlling that program for both its engineering, its costs, and the timing. And so the Atlas became a very, very major problem with the Air Force, and they were about to cancel it, when fortunately they set up a thing that was called configuration management. And I happened to be there in San Bernardino where the ballistic missile headquarters was, and I was a part of that headquarters. And so with a lot of hard work and a lot of changes of the people, we were able to control not only the engineering changes, which was a big, big expense, but also control the timing on this, and also control the people that were contributing. By that I mean the people that were contributing were managers or other parts that were contributing to not just design, but build the Atlas program. And so after getting into this thing, there were about 4 or 5 of us that really set this thing up so that any engineering change that came into there had to pass through one or the other of us. There were 2 that were head of the so-called Configuration Control Board and of the Engineering Change Group. And so with that background, we had one of the people from the Ballistic Missile Organization was then, while he was there, and he had been promoted to Brigadier General, his name is Phillips, he then went to the Apollo program in Washington. And when I told him and a few others that I was going to retire, he said, why don't you come down to Huntsville? I can arrange a meeting with Dr. von Braun and the 3 people that I mentioned, Eberhard Rees and Rudolph. So I flew in here in a T-33, arranged the visit with them, and the weather was terrible, and we spent about 45 minutes to an hour talking about flying. And Dr. von Braun wanted to do that. So I then went over to Dr. Rudolph's, and Arthur's whole office was filled with books and everything else, and he didn't know where the first book was, in fact. But anyway, I told him what I thought I could really help with, and that was getting an early handle on all of the engineering aspects of the Saturn V program. And he said, well, we've been doing that for a long time. And I said, no, we really haven't been doing it, after I questioned him a little bit. I said, the reason you haven't been doing it is because you or one of your people do not control engineering changes. They're being controlled out of the laboratories. And he said, well, and that's where it's supposed to be? And I said, of course it's not where it's supposed to be. You're running this program. You're charged with the money. You're charged with the schedule. You're charged with everything. And he said, the only thing you've got to do, that is to me, now that you know how to do this thing, you're going to be not just my manager or my deputy manager. You're also going to take over engineering changes. And so, with a little background, quite a little background, I then set up an office so that any engineering change coming into us, either from a contractor or from the laboratory, and the laboratories were very powerful, believe me. And so I would take a look at it, and one of the criteria I established was, number one, the man that initiated the engineering change must come before the board, and I'm chairing the board. Number two, if it's anything over $10,000, the laboratory director is going to come in and defend his change. So those were criteria that kind of settled everybody back for a moment or two, and they're all mad, of course. And so Werner von Braun had a Sunday meeting every Sunday with guys that that'd come over with him. And he was getting all kinds of complaints about me because I was not giving them a chance to get their engineering changes through. Long story short, we then actually moved this thing into a sub-program, if you will, where we had configuration people and engineering change people that really looked things over before they came. And then, of course, we had two other centers that we had to worry about, both Johnson, since they were flying out of the Saturn V, and Kennedy, since they were the ones that were getting us in and going to launch the vehicle. So we had a lot of interface that had to be done. And so we established a man in Kennedy and a man in Johnson in the same position that I was. And we would have a monthly meeting, or sooner if necessary, to settle on the impact of any change that we might make to them or they on us. And that was probably one of the biggest solvers that had happened in the whole program, because we would meet and we would divide it up from the standpoint of research into this thing, and if they didn't have a good picture or we didn't have a picture, why, it was turned back and we'd do some more work and come back a little later. But we did get a handle on it. We did know who was trying to make the change, what it was going to cost us to make, what the impact on the other parts of that vehicle were going to be by making that change. And so we then established about 3 or 4 people within each of the parts of the Saturn V. That is, of course, the Johnson part, which was your airplane, if you will, and the Kennedy part, which was all of your ground equipment. And so with those people looking at their problems and then looking at what it would do, for example, to the first stage of the Saturn V by the Kennedy people and by the people in Houston, what would happen to our third stage and what would happen to the instrument unit that we had. So we had penned down by, I would say, within a month and a half to 2 months, the real thinking that came into the impact of taking an engineering proposal and either making it or breaking it or coming back with some other ways to do it. And so that, to me, was probably the finest thing that we set up. And we set it up because we surely didn't want to have happen what happened to the Air Force. And so we were using the experience, and when we needed some help and we weren't getting it, why, we always had a man by the name of Sam Phillips, who was sitting up in the Apollo program, and he was expecting all three of us from each of the centers to work this thing together. And when things happened and you needed some more help, well, all you had to do was call Sam, and he would make sure there was help. So it was just a wonderful thing in my mind that we were able to get an early hand on this thing. And by the way, Werner in his Sunday meetings would tell me what was happening, and he said things are getting better, you know, as things did get better. And Arthur Rudolph was just a wonderful guy to work with that you've ever seen, because he's probably one of the best engineering people, as was Eberhard Rees. And between the two of them, when things came in, and they would come over and say, what do you need or not need? And I usually would have an answer that said, we're going to have to fix this, this, and this, and it's going to take a number of bucks, and I've got the numbers it's going to take, but we do need to move, and we need to move now, because our calendar was getting shorter all the time. Mm-hmm. We had, when I got here, it was in March of 1965, and as this time went on and time was getting shorter, why, we were in hardware cutting. And whenever we'd run into a problem, we had an early alert kind of thing set up with this office too. And this was in the Saturn V program. So those were the kind of things that we did to get things started, to keep things moving. And it took 24 hours a day to do that kind of work. In my opinion, it was an operational vehicle, but it was costing too much money to launch. And we had the shuttle coming along. And so you had to do one or the other. And the uses of the Saturn V were much more limited, of course. And in fact, there were a lot of decision making that went on. When do we even cut this thing off? And I think they ran it out, but they still had a couple of launch vehicles that could have gone. I think it was a good decision they made. I really do. And I was so totally for the shuttle coming on, and it wasn't the kind of a shuttle we wanted. As you may or may not remember, I took over program development there for about 10 or 12 years, and I was in the early throes of the development of the shuttle, and getting money from President Nixon and those kind of things. And so it was quite a revelation, if you will, when that decision was made and we went to the shuttle, and Nixon personally said, you are not going to have a fully blown shuttle as you described it. You're going to have to do some other way, because we gave him a bill and he said, no, the most you're going to have is $7.5 million or $1 billion. And he said, anything else that you come back to me for, I'll cancel the damn program. And that was it. So we took him at his word and went back and regrouped and split things that Johnson would do and we would do. And that's how we came out with what you're looking at today. And but it was a good decision. Had to be.
Well, you know, the years working with Werner was very nice. It's a total of about 16 years from the time Hans Maus came up as this Lunar Program Planning Office, and I was Maus's more or less right-hand man for a long time. And then going to Washington for that last year and a half. And, you know, getting to know Werner very well, I think, was, you know, was quite exciting. Werner was quite a guy. I mean, I have a lot of anecdotes. There's some of the things I wrote down in that thing, like Well, after he had retired and I come back to Huntsville, he still was on the board of directors of a bank in Decatur. And one time I was going on travel, I was flying back to Washington for whatever reason, and he was on the airplane coming back from a meeting, a bank meeting, and he was up in first class, and being a good government employee, we always fly, coach. And he invited me to come sit with him, so well, I mean, he says, come sit with him, you're going to sit with him, so we were sitting up there in first class. And pretty soon the stewardess came along and said, you can't sit up here, you're a coach passenger. So he got up and came back with me, and we spent the 2 hours flying to Washington together back in coach. And that was the last time I saw him alive. We had a very nice conversation going back to Washington. A number of things. We went on a trip one time back in the Apollo era. He always liked once a month or once a quarter or thereabouts. He liked to make a tour of the prime contractors on the West Coast, and I went along once on one of these trips. We flew into Gulfstream with Gulfstream had 12 passengers, and he had it full, and we flew from here to Seattle to start out by talking to Boeing. And the Gulfstream won't make that without a refueling stop, so we had made arrangements to stop at a Strategic Air Command base between here and there to fuel up. And we were going to go land there, and the base commander was going to give us all a lunch and have lunch with the base commander and so forth. But von Braun liked to fly the airplane, so he was flying the airplane, and he started to let down, getting ready to go into the SAC base somewhere in the vicinity of the Great Stone Faces of Mount Rushmore. And von Braun decided he wanted us to see the faces very well. So he went down pretty low, and he tilted the airplane up on the side so we could all look down at those faces. And I don't ever remember what the Great Stone Faces looked like, because this was August. And all I remember is all those August visitors looking up at this crazy airplane flying by on its side low. And so then we went on, and we had a nice lunch, and we went on to Seattle, and we went to Boeing, and then we moved our way back south on the West Coast, and we ended up, this was towards the end of Apollo, and we were getting ready to, we were in a design process for Skylab, and von Braun decided he wanted to compare the capabilities of the Skylab telescopes with Mount Palomar, which obviously is the largest ground-based observatory. So we had made arrangements to fly into Camp Pendleton, and we were met there by some Marines, and the Marines were going to take us up to Mount Palomar. And they must have had some premonition about their bus not being in the best condition, because they were following along behind this bus with a pickup truck filled with jerry cans of gasoline. And sure enough, half the way up Mount Palomar, the bus conked out. And so we all climbed out of the bus, and the 12 of us climbed onto back into this pickup truck, and von Braun was the first one to sit down in a jerry can, so we all went the rest of the way up to Mount Palomar. And we were met at Mount Palomar by the original designer of the facility. And he talked to us about the design capability and what was in Mount Palomar. And we toured the facility and talked to him, and then they catered dinner in for the 12 of us. And after dinner, it got dark, and we were introduced to a gentleman by the name of Dr. Jesse Greenstein, who was an astronomer who was an expert in white dwarfs. And we all got to look through this big telescope at Mount Palomar, and got this lecture on white dwarfs and type of thing until about 1:30 a.m. And they sent, the Marine base sent up a series of station wagons to take us back. I guess they gave up on the buses. But anyway, on the way back down, von Braun got to talking. I was in the same car with von Braun, and he got to talking about the fact that he was all hepped up on astronomy. And he said, when we get back to the BOQ, why don't you all come down to my room? He says, I'll talk to you about astronomy. And sure enough, we did. When he wants you to do something, I mean, you didn't say no. So the 12 of us all went to his room, and he lectured till about 5 o'clock in the morning. And at which time we had to go to the BOQ for breakfast, and then we went back to the Gulfstream to fly back to Huntsville. So we got to sleep on the airplane, but we had that nice discussion about astronomy. And well, there's other things. One time, von Braun went to the Greek islands. He went to the Isle of Delos, because Delos in Greek mythology is the It was the birthplace of Apollo. And so he wanted to compare the birthplace of Apollo with, you know, the Apollo vehicle. And so I happened to be in Washington for whatever reason, and he was returning, and he came back from there. And I don't know exactly what he did in Washington, but anyway, he joined us on the Gulfstream to fly from Washington back to Huntsville. And he regaled us for that 2-hour flight with Greek mythology and Delos and everything he'd seen there. And that clicked with me. You know, I always thought about, dude, that might be nice. And 35 years later, a couple of summers ago, my wife and I actually went to Delos. We saw that, you know, just like Von Braun told me 30-some years ago was what it was like. That was kind of fun. Another time, there was a General O'Connor here, General Ed O'Connor, who was an Air Force general. He was in charge of all the projects at Marshall. He was in charge of an organization called Industrial Operations, but he had Saturn V, Saturn 1B, Saturn I, Engine Program Office, and this, I forget the title of the office that had these other unmanned vehicles that later were transferred to Lewis. But anyway, all of these guys reported to O'Connor, and O'Connor would fly in the airplane. And we had a Queen Air, a Super Queen Air, in addition to the Gulfstream in those days. And O'Connor and Harry Gorman and a couple other guys, we were going up to Washington, and we had prepared some testimony for Von Braun to give to the Congress. And we were going to meet him for breakfast the next morning. But O'Connor was flying the airplane, and we ran into icing conditions on the way to Washington. And he was pumping glycol out. In fact, he was running low on glycol just to get rid of the ice. And he had to make a determination of whether we should land before the mountains or whether he'd risk it going over the mountains and going on into National Airport. And he finally decided to go on into National. And so we ended up landing in National. But he was almost bone dry in terms of the glycol time we landed. And the ice coming off the propellers had completely stripped the paint off the two nacelles on this Queen Air. And the next morning we were telling Von Braun about this trip and all this icing. And Von Braun's eyes just absolutely glazed over. I mean, he was absolutely upset that he missed this trip. And he started telling us about the barnstorming days in the early years, you know, back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, I guess, when he was flying and they didn't know anything about de-icing. And if you were in icing conditions, you were in real trouble.
So there were launches still taking place when we moved already here to Fort Bliss. And the first major project in Fort Bliss was the development of the Redstone. And Redstone, of course, the Redstone missile got its name from the Redstone test range. Some people think it went the other way around, but the range was really the reason for naming the Redstone the Redstone. We had worked on the Redstone already in Fort Bliss, because, as I said, only about 30 people were involved in actually launching the vehicles, and most of the people were available to work on future projects. And although the Army in the beginning did not really give us a major project, and we felt a little bit unhappy, we felt that we were put on ice and that they just wanted to keep us away from the Russians, and that was the reason that we were in Fort Bliss. But Von Braun, of course, gave us some major tasks, and one, of course, was to have a follow-on to the V2. What would we do next as a V2? And we started really on the basic layout of the Redstone in Fort Bliss. And you probably know the main difference between the V2 and the Redstone is the fact that the Redstone separates the warhead. For the Redstone, only the warhead re-enters. And the warhead has even the guidance and control system. So we have re-entry control, which we did not have for the V2.